President Joe Biden pushes for a ceasefire deal as Israel pushes deeper into Rafah.
This is truly a decisive moment. Israel has made their proposal. Hamas says it wants a ceasefire. This deal is an opportunity to prove whether they really mean it.
How a Doomsday Seed Vault is protecting the world's food supply as the world struggles to cope with the impacts of climate change.
We don't know yet what crisis we will be facing in the future, and to make sure that we are well equipped to deal with that.
And Donald Trump remains defiant after becoming the first former U.S. president convicted of felony crimes. Today is Saturday, June 1st. Join us as we explore the issues in the news. Hi, everyone. I'm Lori London in Washington. As Israeli forces push deeper into the southern Gaza city of Rafah, President Joe Biden said Israel has agreed to a three-phase ceasefire deal, and he urged Hamas to take it.
Think what will happen if this moment is lost. We can't lose this moment. Indefinite war in pursuit of an unidentified notion of total victory will only bog down Israel and Gaza.
In remarks at the White House Friday, the president said the first phase would include a full and complete ceasefire, a withdrawal of Israeli forces from all populated areas of Gaza, and the release of some hostages in exchange for freeing hundreds of Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails. Biden said Israel has done enough to devastate Hamas over the last 8 months.
At this point, Hamas no longer is capable of carrying out another October 7th.
In response, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government released a statement saying Israel is eager for the return of the hostages as soon as possible, noting that Netanyahu had authorized the negotiating team to present a proposal to that end and would also enable Israel to continue the war until all objectives are achieved. And despite U.S. warnings against a full-scale offensive and an order by the top United Nations Court for Israel to halt its assault on Rafah, Israeli Defense Forces are moving further into the city. For some perspective on international law when it comes to war and the World Court Authority, I spoke with Amanda Ghahremani, research fellow at the Human Rights Center at the University of California Berkeley. In the past weeks, we have had a couple of major things come out of the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. And I think people get confused about the two and what they are. The International Court of Justice ordered Israel to stop its military operations in Rafah. How is that related to, can you differentiate the difference between these two separate decisions in world bodies?
Absolutely. So the case before the International Court of Justice is looking at Israel's responsibility as a state. And its focus here is specifically on genocide. So under the Genocide Convention, Israel must not engage in genocide, and it must also prevent and punish genocide. So the preliminary measures that come out of the International Court of Justice are intended to prevent the possible further commission of genocide as the court itself evaluates South Africa's legal case against Israel. Now, at the same time, there's a parallel process underway at a different court, which is the International Criminal Court. And the International Criminal Court is not about state accountability. It's about individual criminal responsibility. So the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court announced last week that it has asked the court to issue arrest warrants against two senior Israeli leaders, namely Benjamin Netanyahu, the current prime minister, and Yoav Gallant, the minister of defense, as well as three senior Hamas leaders. Now, for these arrest warrants, the prosecutor is not looking at genocide, but rather at war crimes and crimes against humanity, which are legally distinct categories of international crimes. So these are two distinct legal processes, but much of the evidence needed to prove genocide may also overlap with war crimes and crimes against humanity.
So as far as the Court of Justice ruling that orders Israel to stop its operations in Rafah, how does that relate to the decision that it came to?
The ruling that was issued last week is the third time the court has issued provisional measures in this case. In early May, South Africa asked the court to urgently modify its previous provisional measures in light of the escalating humanitarian crisis in Rafah. The court responded with this ruling, which it's allowed to do if it believes that there's been been a change in the situation on the ground that warrants a modification of its prior measures. So first of all, the court explained that the circumstances in Rafah have changed significantly since its previous measures, enough so to warrant new measures. The court stated very clearly that all the humanitarian concerns that it had when it issued its previous measures have materialized, and it described the current humanitarian situation in Rafah as disastrous. Israel's bombardments of Rafah have caused more than 800,000 people to be displaced, and the court stated that there was no evidence to show that Israel has undertaken effective measures to evacuate and enhance the security of civilians in the Gaza Strip during these operations. So the court ultimately ordered Israel to do four things. First, immediately halt its offensive in Rafah. Second, Israel must allow unimpeded access to any UN-mandated bodies to investigate and document what is happening. 3, to comply with all the prior measures, which include ensuring the Rafah border crossing stays open so that urgent humanitarian aid can be provided at scale. And finally, 4, Israel needs to report back in a month on its compliance. And the court also reminded all parties that it has also previously called for the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages held by Hamas's military wing, and it reiterated these measures as well.
Since that decision came out, we have seen Israel's operation into Rafah only deepen. Several strikes have been extremely deadly for Palestinians that were seeking refuge in tent camps and just outside of Rafah. Israel also said this week that it expects the war to continue through the end of this year. Is there any way the court has to enforce this, or is it mainly symbolic?
That's a very fair question, because in fact, although the judgment is legally binding, the court itself doesn't have any means to enforce its own judgments. The court essentially relies on states to either voluntarily comply or to be pressured by the international community to comply. So, for example, the United Nations Security Council could issue a binding resolution to enforce the court's order, but that's unfortunately not a viable avenue here because the United States has veto power and has used its veto power consistently to shield Israel from accountability. Other states, especially Israel's political allies, can increase the pressure on Israel to respect the rule of law and to comply with this order by stopping its military operations, and especially those countries that arm Israel. In fact, this provisional measure, as well as the prior orders by the court, put all countries that supply weapons to Israel on notice that they too can be implicated in genocide if they continue to arm Israel and if Israel continues to defy the ICJ's orders. So the only means that are available here are really international pressure.
So far, Israel has not given in to international pressure. What does this mean for Israel standing on the international stage, and will it have an impact in general, not heeding the warnings from the international community about their grave concerns about the humanitarian issues?
Well, by initiating these operations, like you mentioned, in Rafah to begin with, Israel has ignored the International Court of Justice's previous provisional measures. And since this last judgment on the 24th of May, as you mentioned, Israel continued its operations, including the recent airstrike that killed, I think, over 40 Palestinians, including children, and injured hundreds more. So clearly, Israel is overtly defying the International Court of Justice and showing through its actions that it doesn't plan to comply with the court's orders at all. And this seriously does undermine international law and international norms, as well as the institutions that are meant to uphold them. I think, what this means for Israel on the international stage is that many of Israel's allies, for them, I think it's becoming more and more untenable to justify and support Israel's actions. Countries like Canada, Germany, other European states that are big proponents of international justice, including the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court as institutions, they're going to have to make some policy changes vis-a-vis Israel, lest they be seen as hypocrites. And countries that are arming Israel will also have to consider, again, their own implication in genocide if they continue to supply these weapons. So I think overall what we're going to see is that this is going to isolate Israel more and more from its own allies if it continues to ignore the ICJ's orders and if it continues its operations.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us and providing your insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Amanda Ghahremani, criminal law attorney and research fellow at the Human Rights Center at the University of California, Berkeley. Donald Trump launched fresh attacks Friday on the judge in his criminal trial and continued to undermine New York's criminal justice system following his conviction on 34 criminal charges. The ex-president argued the verdict was illegitimate and driven by politics.
It was a rigged trial. We wanted a venue change where we could have a fair trial. We didn't get it. We wanted a judge change. We wanted a judge that wasn't conflicted.
Ahead of his Gaza remarks Friday, President Biden responded to Trump's conviction and attacks on the justice system.
It's reckless. It's dangerous. It's irresponsible for anyone to say this was rigged just because they don't like the verdict. Our justice system has endured for nearly 250 years, and it literally is the cornerstone of America.
I spoke with criminal defense attorney Jack Rice about the historic nature of the nation's first former president to be convicted of crimes.
To call this historic doesn't even do it justice. We've been hearing this word over and over, but this is actually something else. To actually see a former president of the United States convicted of not just one, but 34 felonies is really quite astounding. And frankly, for those who are simply looking at the criminal justice system, there is this question of whether or not the system is fair. Now, for some, maybe it's just the people who wanted him convicted. I think the real question becomes, is there anybody above the law? And I think today they would say the answer is no. In fact, even a former president can be convicted of a crime. We've never seen anything like this in the past. So this is a really amazing day when it comes to what that means. For those who are saying that this was all, as the former president just said, this is a shambles, that this was all a setup. This was part of the legal witch hunt. You're going to see that crowd continuing to voice that opinion too. So you have both sides. You're seeing the sort of tearing apart of the country in a sense, that schism that we have seen over the last 8 years and then some, really starting to highlight itself in the wake of these decisions.
If you were to round up what these guilty charges mean, these 34 charges, what basically say?
A jury of 12 determined that former President Trump, when he was running for office, essentially falsified business documents. And there were 34 counts separately against him. But what this was really about was not just the documents themselves, it was why it was done. So it was a combination of the documents themselves, but if you actually add what this was about the election, if you will, too. So that was both sides of that. But again, I think what makes it so dramatic is that this wasn't just one count of 34. This was every single count where this jury came back unanimously. And you can understand just how dramatic, how frankly historic, we come back to that word, that we have, that you have a jury of 12 people, just everyday, normal, average Americans who are sitting in judgment, which they do every day across the country for defendants, to actually have a former president in the box, essentially the defendant in this case, and then having them judge him. That is part of what makes this so astounding, because this doesn't happen in most places in the world. And frankly, this has never happened in the United States before. And so when you see that, it really does show an extraordinarily unique system that doesn't happen every day and certainly doesn't happen in large swaths of the world.
What happens next?
President Trump's team certainly has the right to appeal, and they're absolutely going to do that. At the same time, what you're going to see in New York is they would do a pre-sentence investigation, and ultimately there would be a sentencing. It's likely that what will happen is that's going to be continued out as well for a whole series of reasons. And I would expect that Trump's team is going to try to avoid a sentencing in this case even before the election itself. I doubt that the judge is going to allow that, because we're talking about, at this point, about 5 months, and that is extraordinary even when it comes to New York on this issue. So I expect to see a sentence, but that sentence may not come down until September, October potentially.
Could he go to jail for this, or what could be the ramifications of this verdict?
Former President Trump could go to prison for this. He could also be sent to jail, if you will. So in other words, he'd be serving less than a year. At the same time, because this is essentially a first time for the former president, there is the potential that, in fact, he could simply serve probation, meaning he'll never serve a day in jail. trial. But that doesn't mean that the conviction doesn't stick. That doesn't mean that he would have a whole series of requirements and oversight by the system itself, which is what we see all over the country for all sorts of defendants who are found guilty or plead guilty to charges.
Now that he is a convicted felon, does that hinder his ability to be president?
Former President Trump has the right to continue to run for office and even to be elected.
Criminal defense attorney Jack Rice, thank you so much.
Thank you.
The guilty verdict appeared to motivate Trump's base of supporters who began pouring donations into his campaign. It's unclear if any of this will help him with independent voters who will be decisive in the November presidential election. You're listening to Issues in the News. I'm Laurie London.
Heat waves all around the globe are becoming hotter, more intense, and also more frequent due to climate change.
In the last few days and weeks, extreme weather has created life-threatening conditions with scorching heat waves, record rainfall, and mudslides in Asia, the Middle East, many African nations, and across Latin America. José Philippe, researcher at the Royal Netherlands Meteorological Institute.
The hotter the world and the hotter the heat waves, the more other types of extremes we can also see. For instance, floods. Indeed, if glaciers melt, we can see more floods related to that. But also the atmosphere can contain more moist if it's hotter. So if it rains, then it can also rain more. And that's how climate change does not only affect heat waves, but also all kinds of other extremes.
Thousands were buried and presumed dead in a mudslide in Papua New Guinea, while markets and residential areas in parts of India and Bangladesh were submerged in floodwaters in the aftermath of a cyclone.
Approximately 6,500 people have been rescued so far.
Meanwhile, drought and sweltering heat are worsening an ongoing humanitarian crisis in war-ravaged Afghanistan.
The effects of course, the global climate crisis was also seen firsthand. It's caused widespread water scarcity, generating new food, health, and nutrition needs. Over 50 million people in Afghanistan face high levels of food insecurity.
Some scientists say they're hard-pressed to remember when so much of the world has had its weather on overdrive at the same time. Guillermo Lagonda, director of climate and resilience with the World Food Program, says the cycle of El Niño climate phenomenon is exacerbating the impacts of the climate crisis, destroying agriculture and crops in vulnerable communities dealing with conflict and other shocks.
Out of the three big drivers of hunger, conflicts, economic shocks, climate extremes, the climate dimension is the one that can be most reliably predicted. And that also goes for the El Niño-related droughts and floods. So we have what it takes to forecast these damaging events. We have what it takes to protect lives before they need saving. But what we need to do is to make these systems and processes accessible and available also in fragile contexts where people are usually disconnected from these services.
Beyond predicting extreme weather events, there are efforts to protect the world's food supply and safeguard agricultural diversity. The Global Seed Vault, also known as the Doomsday Vault, built on the side of a frozen mountain in Norway, is storing more than 1 million seed samples from nearly every country. I talked about it with Global Crop Trust Executive Director Stefan Schmitz.
It's a seed bank of the seed banks. There are many seed banks around the world. More than 1,700 are registered by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations in Rome. And to make sure that whatever happens to one of those seed banks, duplicates of those seeds are securely saved in another place. So,
why is this Svalbard Seed Vault so important for life on Earth?
I give you one example, and perhaps this tells best how important it is. A very important in International Agricultural Research Institute in Aleppo in Syria that also hosted a huge seed bank in it, specialized in seeds, also wheat, rye, lentils, barley, sorghum, and the like. All those crops that are able to withstand harsher climate, drought. This institute, along with its seed bank during the Syrian civil war has been completely destroyed. Fortunately, years before the outbreak of the war, the entire collection with more than 100,000 seed samples had been duplicated and the duplicates sent to Svalbard. Without Svalbard, these more than 100,000 different seed samples would have been lost forever. It's the ultimate backup for the world's gene bank.
Tell us a little bit about how they're preserved and how it works.
The seed vault is deep down in one of the mountains on the archipelago of Svalbard. It's actually the northernmost place on Earth which you can reach by a regular scheduled airplane. There, this seed vault is down in a mountain with 3 large chambers. Each of those chambers provides enough space for roughly 1.5 million seed samples. So altogether, there is enough space for 4.5 million seed samples. Ambient temperature within this mountain is around -5, -6 degrees. It needs to be cooled down to -18 degrees Celsius to make sure that it has the ideal environment for those seeds to keep their ability to keep alive as long as possible. And in most cases, they will stay alive there at those low temperatures. It depends on the crop, 20, 30, 40, sometimes 50 years they can survive in this surrounding. Before they have sent there, the seeds have been cleaned, dried, vacuumized, and sealed, and then sent to Svalbard and stored there at -18 degrees.
And they come from all over the world?
Yeah, from India, from Germany, from Brazil, from many countries in Africa, from the US, from Canada, from all places. Breeders sometimes need to be able to crossbreed new varieties that are able to withstand changing climate conditions, be able to cope with biotic and abiotic stresses. They often need 50 to 100 different genetic traits from separate old existing varieties.
We are seeing many global crises related to drought and climate change and a warming planet, hunger. It's already a reality. It's not even in the future. Is this partly to make sure that the seeds survive to adapt? Would they actually be able to be utilized in places that have no water and it's too hot for life?
The crisis is already now. So critical already today are those more than 1,700 gene banks around the world. And it's becoming even more important in the future. On top of those 1,700 seed banks on Earth comes this one specific seed vault as an ultimate backup to make sure if one, two, or many of those existing seed banks is in a hazard, gets lost, to make sure that those treasure troves are not disappeared forever.
Is this vital to our future life on Earth, given what we are witnessing with this changing planet?
It's a life insurance. The more than 1,700 seed banks, they make sure that plant breeders have the access to it and they can fight this constant fight against changing climate, against new pests and diseases. And the Svalbard seed vault comes on top of it. It's let's say more or less a second layer of security to make sure that we can survive with a growing world population under growing threat with changing climate, and perhaps new pests, new diseases will come in times of climate change. We don't know yet what crisis we will be facing in the future. And to make sure that we are well equipped to deal with that, it is so important to conserve as many seeds as we can.
Global Crop Trust Executive Director Stefan Schmitz. And that's all the time we have this week. On behalf of all of us here at VOA, thank you very much for listening. Join us next week for more issues in the news. Until then, I'm Lori London.